Last reporting session for the working group sessions. I'd like to ask session number 1 if you're ready to come and report, please.
So once again, group 1, so we're the status of the existing observing systems, one of the 2 groups looking at that. So we took our recommendations from yesterday, tightened them up, combined a couple. We're down to 8 from 14, which we're pretty happy with. So I'll just go through these briefly. So the first is increasing the coverage in the Eurasian sector with respect to observations and data access. So again, encouraging and promoting access with Russia, which has been, I think, a theme throughout. Using examples of existing collaboration. Pay attention to the fact that access to data from the Eurasian sector is limited. And finally, final task of working towards free and open access to Arctic data and metadata as soon as data are QC'd. And we originally had that as, I think that's meant not just for the Eurasian sector. That's how it is. It's with the target audiences of Say on Board working with the Arctic Council. So recommendation 2, increasing the diversity of the organizing committee and the audiences at AOS 2014. Again, I think something that we've heard and specifically wanted to call out a better regional representation, i.e. residents of the Arctic, better geographical representation, and then a better balance between science, industry, and funding agencies at AOS 2014. Recommendation 3 is integrating the topic of the changing carbon cycle, which was noted as a topic that was absent in the white papers. That's recommendation 4. Minimizing the administrative barriers to conducting research in and on the Arctic waters, in the land, and in the airspace, of course, while respecting local communities. So this involves things like simplifying the clearances, simplifying transfer of samples across borders, unifying and simplifying procedures and documentation for data exchange, and incentivizing financially, presumably, and supporting joint international Arctic studies. So the way that we reduced the number of recommendations is we combined half of them into recommendation 5. So recommendation 5 is so assemble an international group that's funded to design a comprehensive system for Arctic observations with a mandate to influence long-term funding and infrastructure investments with a focus on being dynamic and flexible. And so under that, one of the main tasks was to create and present a plan at the next AOS while taking into account existing efforts to do the following, and then we have these subtasks of listing the applications that are addressing stakeholder requirements, identifying essential variables, using a combined group of stakeholders, establish a set of questions that a mature Arctic observing system must address, ensure that we have communication with the entire stakeholder community throughout the development of the questions and the definition of applications, et cetera. Document observational user requirements quantitatively for these essential variables and applications. Perform an assessment of current observing system capabilities, propose observing system experiments and or observing system simulation experiments to assess the impact of observations, identify the gaps, and then make recommendations to fill those gaps with the system design. So another task that fell under recommendation 5 was identify the observational, spatial, and temporal scales that are most important, that have the most impact, and also to integrate industry platforms into the Arctic observing system, data capture and dissemination. So that had lots of target audiences, space agencies, funding agencies, and looking for endorsement from both the SAON board and the IASC, the WOC. And so recommendation 6. We felt that an essential component in the Arctic observing system was remote sensing, and so that must be available on a continuous basis without gaps as we bring the technology up to date. To make sure that remote sensing observations are integrated with ground-based observations, and that data is available to all stakeholders. And so 2 specific tasks that relate to that recommendation are developing the capacity at a community level for remote sensing. It's one that we brought up yesterday of localize remote sensing data in real time so communities can request and use them for their own needs. This idea of having a drone or an AUV or a UAV that could be deployed to survey a local area of interest as opposed to relying just on satellite data. And then continue dialogue with space agencies about continuing satellite observations. So that's space agencies and funding agencies. And then our last 2, sustain and strengthen multipurpose flagship platforms. So use the existing stations as templates and extend them to become super sites, increasing coverage through a diversity of different types of sites, large, medium, local scale. And then also, we noted that was largely focused on land-based sites, and so expanding that to the marine domain we felt was important, and using Interact, for example, and GCW as target audience. And the final recommendation, promote the development and adoption of modern technologies for both direct observations with real-time data transmission and comprehensive process studies in high spatial and temporal resolution in multiple dimensions, maintain data collection with current technologies to avoid gaps in data and time series, and further develop buoy networks and other autonomous data capture methods to harbor more sensors. And those target audiences with funding agencies, GCW, WMO, and the private sector. Anyone have any questions? Great.
There's a question right here.
Oh.
My comment is on the, I find the operational agencies missing a little bit, both as partners and as target audiences. And of course, participants in the AOS.
Right, yeah, that's fair enough. We can fill that in. Great.
Hey, Jean-Claude?
You mentioned
I'm sorry.
You mentioned super sites.
Yes.
Like TXC, Eurasian.
Yes.
I don't see if you already know about is it, why are they missing these? They were just
Those were just examples. Yeah, it was not meant to be a comprehensive list, but you can.
And what about this idea of the super sites drifting in the center of the Arctic? This has been addressed on several occasions in the past. What are the situation there?
We didn't have the time to fully go into that, but we have actually written in there that we have to expand from the terrestrial to the marine side, so that would come in under that, you know, when we finish that out.
Thank you. Group number 2, David? So I know these are synthesis of most of the week, but if we can try to keep maybe the recommendation, not go into too much details, but then, you know, it doesn't take an hour to eat a sandwich, so you can also go over lunch a little bit.
No point in putting all this up. Okay, so worked on integrating a fair bit of feedback that we received from the group. So I'll just reiterate the main sectors that we were looking at. Private sector collaboration. I'll just hit on a few points, I think. Again, interest of time. Recommendations here is to engage international groups such as the World Ocean Council to lead an initiative to gather industry partners together to raise the question of Arctic data sharing, coordination, joint data collection programs. As well, outreach to the private sector to provide more direct support to the AOS process, so participation in the next summit or financial support. Okay. Linking operational observational programs to science and stakeholder information needs implementing the Global Cryosphere Watch. Let's see here. So in this case, through recommendations, through a process of meetings, development of demonstration sites, explore relative value of and needs for specific observations targeted by the scientific community and stakeholders. Classify current and emerging networks for cryospheric observations and identify those that contribute data, funding, or stakeholder involvement. And then integrate more with international groups such as the World Meteorological Organization. So try to feed more information into the WMO panel for polar observations, research services, and so on. All right. Again, this isn't all of them, but integration with Global Earth observation system of systems. So for the next AOS meeting, we need more formal involvement from GEOS, some sort of presentation or something about how they can help the Arctic community for observation needs. And then need to determine how the Arctic research community is represented in the context of GEOS, i.e. link through SAON, might not be enough. Okay, Arctic global linkages. And this focuses on ideas that, for example, weather issues in the Arctic do not remain confined to the Arctic, but weather impacts can be felt in mid-latitude countries and so on, so that they do need to be engaged in thinking about the Arctic. So discuss with non-Arctic countries, figure out their requirements for data in Arctic regions, coordinate their Arctic expeditions into the Arctic Observing Network, and even somehow engage their participation in the next summit in some way. Enhance regional observing system for northern shipping routes. Prepare basic data to improve weather forecasting up there. Okay. International ship-based coordination. So of course we've heard that we have numerous ships, major research infrastructure operating in the north, very little coordination. Try to build up and work with existing forums to coordinate this. And improvement of access to other nations' exclusive economic zones. And then the data recommendation, so data access, data rescue, and then this was expanded out right into various topics such as data discovery, let's see, data access, data rescue and assimilation, data management and use training, so this appeared today, data integration, data coordination. So our data subgroup was very active, and there are recommendations and so on under all of these, and I no time to get into all of that. So, but
any comments or issues or questions? Yes.
For the ship-based activity, one opportunity is to utilize. For the ship-based data, one opportunity is to utilize the automatic identification system information, which is pan-Arctic coverage on a daily basis or sub-daily throughout the year, including during the winter. Includes all of the ships that are 400 tons and larger anywhere in the Arctic Ocean.
Right. Actually, well, one of the questions that was raised was how do we gain such information for smaller vessels, so ships that are 200 feet and smaller in length.
A solution could be to the Arctic, the International Maritime Organization is currently working on guidelines for shipping. The International Maritime Organization is currently working on guidelines for polar waters. They could have a guideline that, or a requirement for all ships traveling north of the Arctic Circle to have the automatic identification system on board.
Right. So that could be a recommendation.
But if I may, that's certainly having an inventory of ship tracks and what ships are in the Arctic is great, but the real need is what are they doing? If they're doing science, what are they sampling, what are they doing, and how can we get those programs to talk to each other to not duplicate effort and work together? That's that level of coordination also at the program level that's really missing, even within different countries. So that's a bit what we're touching about, in addition to more the logistics of knowing who, you know, who's where. Thanks. Subgroup number 3.
Right, we were one of the groups with 15 recommendations, and we came up with 3, and they're not prioritized, they're just what we had time for. We will be continuing with our process, maybe over lunch I'll be printing out, we'll be continuing our work. But the first one is to undertake a focused effort to determine the constraints for identifying reasons and implications for the imbalance between summer and winter observations. And specific tasks will be to explore the role of new technologies, observing strategies, and community-based monitoring to help close the gap in the observing imbalance. This could be addressed by a cross-disciplinary IASC action group. So our target audience will be funders, institutions engaged in Arctic research, communities, and that IASC action group. The second recommendation is related to an inventory of observations and projects that need to be expanded and continually updated. The tasks involved would be SAON to expand efforts to create Arctic Council Working Group inventory of inventories and data archives, keep track of who's doing the inventories to avoid duplications of effort. We also recommend having different organizations put out a call for contributions of relevant baseline data to the inventory, and that will be linked to a data management process. Target audience, again, SAON, data collectors, different organizations from multiple disciplines. And then our third recommendation is, in advance of the next AOS, to work to engage broader participation and balance, working from the success of existing networks, for example, Interact. The tasks involved will be having the AOS 2013 organizing committee to work with SAON to develop representation from Russia, indigenous groups, and so forth in the organization committee. And then conduct outreach to specific or underrepresented groups, for example, IASA, PPs, and APEX. ISAC can take one of the roles to engage IASA, and Andre has volunteered to talk to the IASA Council as well. And then Interact will work with the IASC Terrestrial Working Group to engage more of the terrestrial community for the next AOS. Target audience, the AOS 2013 Organizing Committee, IASC Working Groups, and Interact. So those are the 3.
Thanks. That was short and sweet. Great. Any comments or complimentary information from that group? No? Thank you. Group number 4.
I think I can be equally brief. I know you're eager for lunch. Our group the first recommendation was how is the Arctic defined, and we decided to use the Arctic Council definition, but allow for flexibility and not propose any tasks or processes to define that any further. We had a long discussion on understanding the need of stakeholders and what observations and products are needed by stakeholders. And what we thought was that we need processes and actions to identify the needs and engage all the right people, and that ISAC should lead a 2014 summit engagement process to help articulate the various stakeholders and their needs, and issue a call to stakeholders to submit what they need with guidelines on how to design, guidelines to them about how to design products, in order to help engage stakeholders prior to Helsinki as well during the meeting with presentations from them and from the stakeholder groups. And this will improve who participates in the summit and will help confirm what the observing network is supposed to do in terms of products, et cetera. And then we had a discussion on what scale of need to address. You know, there's so many on so many different levels, and we have to be careful in articulating what we're asking, but we do need to be transparent about the need for broader representation, but also recognizing that we'll never fully reach that goal, and to practice the art of the possible. So we need an efficient way to solicit input. It will be admittedly imperfect, but it will better identify the stakeholders that we need to have here at the meeting and at the table. And to make sure that the process is in fact an unending conversation and there's mutable criteria. It's an organic process. And the question came up, is there another way to engage stakeholders aside from white papers? And that can be intimidating to some groups or to those who don't have internet access. So if there's an alternate or additional means of participation, that would be encouraged. The target audience here, of course, is the 2014 AOS Program Organizing Committee that would also include a healthy representation of TK representatives. Our third recommendation was to conduct a stakeholder needs assessment, and that was addressed earlier. And then we modified our recommendation 4, which initially was to identify priorities among the above identified needs, and also identifying, observing both scientific and traditional knowledge capacity to address those priorities. We changed that to once a needs assessment is developed, map the observing capacity to stakeholder needs within the matrix, and that was the diagram that Mike showed you yesterday. There's a discussion about how tricky it is to prioritize, and do we really need to do that? And perhaps if the process is organic enough, then the participants can prioritize their own variables so that it can be a living document, and perhaps prioritization would be the last step in the process. So the action here would be for the Arctic Council to assign the task of the needs assessment and development of the tool, the matrix, and the Arctic Council would have oversight of the process that engages two groups. One would be focused on the needs assessment, the other would be on the capability assessment, and map the two against each other, and then develop a matrix or a tool and the workflow needed to measure those priorities. And the type of specialists that would be needed engaged in this process would be a balance of TK and science, equal representation, computer and information technology experts, et cetera. And recommendation 5, of course, is the matrix that synthesizes cross-discipline knowledge and stakeholder needs, and that was addressed above. And finally, we have recommendation 6, which is we need a management and coordination function to carry all of these recommendations forward. And we thought that for the next summit, the Arctic Council needs to assume responsibility for the execution of the needs assessment, capability assessment, management network plan on how to go forward. So that's it. Any questions?
Nope.
Good.
Thanks. Number 5?
Well, we stuck with what we told you about yesterday. We have 2 recommendations. The first of those is that we think a stakeholders forum or advisory group needs to be created to provide advice on observational needs. And that forum should include representation from the full range of stakeholders in the Arctic observing system. This is something that should be accomplished within the next year in time for AOS 2, and so the tasks involved are pretty straightforward. We need to identify stakeholder groups, we need to invite participants, and this group needs to meet at AOS 2. Target audiences, well, this group should be formed within SAON and functioning as a continuing activity of SAON. Recommendation 1. Second recommendation is that we need a common point of reference for a more productive discussion about what the Arctic observing system really is. So we recommend that in preparation for AOS 2, we need a review of the current state of the existing system. Not an exhaustively detailed one, but a review that would focus on summarizing the overall activities and goals of the observing system, including overall descriptions of the arrays of observations, the relevant stakeholders, the major redundancies and gaps in the system, and a list, ideally a short list of candidate observations. But we think that a document like that is really quite important to serve as a point of reference for all of our discussions so that we all know that we're talking about the same thing. And this is another thing that should be prepared in time for AOS 2. The tasks involved include a review of several previous documents that attempt to do this. And this could be a SAON task, or probably it would be better done as a task of the organizing committee for AOS 2. The target audience is, of course, AOS 2. Any questions?
Oh, thank you. Short and sweet. 6.
Okay, so our group picked up on just a few of the points that we addressed yesterday. This was Working Group 6, and we approached the challenge from a stakeholder perspective. So the sort of primary recommendations that we're putting forward also draw on some of our experiences in side meetings and whatnot recently as well. And I guess maybe compared to some of the other groups, that we try to identify really quite tangible, pragmatic things that we could accomplish, you know, literally by the time Helsinki rolls around. There's a random order here. The first one was to improve the capacity for interchange of data and information between data centers and information brokers. And the whole idea here is to continue that process. I know there's a lot of activity going on in this area, but do a key activity that creates an inventory of who's providing web services, who already is open and willing and wanting to share data and information about what's going on. And then we could use that list to, again, provide more detailed discussions on how to improve interoperability, information data dissemination, using these web services and various open standards and whatnot. And also look at how we can facilitate attribution. That's, of course, you know, I guess acknowledging the effort and who's involved with creating and sharing these sorts of things. So the whole idea was to use existing things, maybe the Arctic Hub and advertisements on various listservs to sort of get the ball rolling, present a preliminary list at the Polar Data Forum that's going to be held in Tokyo in the fall. that list can be added to there, so that by the time Helsinki rolls around, we've sort of got a bit of a laundry list of what's going, who's making these data available freely, and that could be used to catalyse all sorts of interesting discussions on that. We've listed the audiences here, but I think if I just generally say, data centres, information brokers, you'll all understand. The next recommendation is to basically, we all talk about it, this need to basically make data more freely available. So to cut to the chase there, we're suggesting that several high-profile data sets that are not currently freely available be identified, and we basically develop a rationale, a justification for why they should be made more freely available and who could use it and whatnot. And then at Helsinki, sit down with the caretakers of those data sets and hopefully use our collective mass and influential bargaining power after 5 p.m. To hopefully negotiate the release of those data sets. So I think that the big target there is, literally by the end of the Helsinki meeting, can we announce, for example, that 3, 4, 5 new large and high-profile data sets will be released to the community that is not currently available to the community now. So again, quite a short-term pragmatic type project. The other thing is to work with the various networks in an effort to identify or encourage, work with them to identify new synthetic activities that will actually use observing data. So obviously we need to identify some champions there within the networks to move this forward, but potentially at least in the lead up to the Helsinki meeting, at least maybe at the Helsinki meeting, present a range of new synthetic activities that are going to be initiated. And I think that the idea there is to use those synthetic opportunities to test the robustness of the observing system, so that in the future lessons learned can be rolled back into the observing system. Okay, we do have some other, along the way we sort of made a few comments, I'm sure other groups did as well, about how this meeting was organised and run and whatnot. So and we've got maybe a few suggestions of how the meeting, how some of these challenges could be addressed in the next meeting. And so there's just some ideas here to maybe help the organisers of that meeting maybe get something out of the Helsinki meeting that we may not have totally got out of this meeting. Some suggestions here include various new and innovative facilitation tools and even professional facilitators, include the opportunity to have disciplinary-based sessions at the Helsinki meeting, try and identify the working groups prior to the meeting so that we can make a quicker start once we get there. With the white papers, we maybe need to target specific groups that may not have necessarily been represented in the white papers submitted to this meeting, and maybe there's a way to sort of format those white papers so it's a little easier to draw commonalities from the different submissions. And again, I think there's a bunch of ideas here on maybe new ways to engage different stakeholders and whatnot. So we're going to put that forward as just in good faith to suggest that maybe some new ideas could be considered in preparation for the Helsinki meeting. I sort of wordsmithed a lot there, so is there anyone from my group that wants to add something that I missed? Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, and as you know, please share those comments, but this afternoon when we have the wrap-up and directions, we'll share all of these, and it would be really nice to have the feedback from the group on ways to improve these things as we move forward. Thanks.
Okay, our group is 7 from the funder's perspective, and yesterday our top recommendation was to print more money. So our first task is to assess which country's money is going to hold its value the most in the next 10 years. So any input into that? So the first one is coordinate international funding efforts, and the task is to develop a paper for AS14 describing existing funding opportunities, models, international umbrella programs that do integrate funding across national borders already. What are the lessons learned, best practices, what's working, what's not, so we know what's happening. We don't have to keep looking for new models. And then identify a case study that's working and show in detail how it actually works. And then I'll leave who does it for later. But the second one was to recommend that the workshop findings include a policy statement to integrate the Arctic into all of the existing global research programs, GEO, WMO, GOOSE, GCOS, GTOS, etc. So the task would be to develop that policy statement and to identify working contacts within each of these programs who work in the Arctic and ensure that this is moving forward. I think in some areas it is, and maybe in some not. To engage the senior administrators and have them present at next year's meeting. The third recommendation was to build on the current list of national reports and develop a comprehensive inventory of assets, networks, et cetera. And the task would be mainly to prepare an inventory synthesis for release as a major keynote at next year's meeting. What are the commonalities in covering the essential core variables amongst all these groups? Where are the gaps in both observing assets, including satellite coverage? If there aren't existing, we thought it'd be important to somehow start developing a working group to identify needs for those big ticket, long planning horizon, international infrastructure needs, whether it's satellites, icebreakers, cabled observatories, communication systems, and identify the processes to influence long-term funding for those. The fourth recommendation was for SAN to encourage and engage non-Arctic countries in Arctic observing activities. And so the task there would be to make sure invitations are in place for the next summit and that non-Arctic countries are fully engaged in all of the summit organization, to give visibility to the role of their contributions and look for ways to increase and support collaborations. And possibly to develop some kind of a formal framework that could provide endorsement and recognition of those collaborations that could add value within those countries so that they would be supported. And I think we can look to the IASC working groups, the Pacific Arctic Group, and some others for some models there. And then our last recommendation was to develop an ongoing stakeholder forum to support the alignment of priorities between stakeholder needs and the observing systems. And the tasks, there are already a lot of stakeholder needs assessments that have been done by various groups. So one task would be to synthesize those existing needs assessments that are already being done, and then to identify gaps. Are there major stakeholder groups that haven't been incorporated in those? Should there be an integrated stakeholder database? I think it could be used for lots of different purposes. So I'll skip who all the partners and target audiences are, but those are our main activities. Any questions? None. Thanks.
Hungry. Last group, please, Jackie.
All right, so we had 3 recommendations that we concluded, went over them some yesterday, but we refined them to develop the portal for the, and the process for the observing system that provides spatial information for location and points to the data sets, basically a search tool. And the 2 tasks within that would be to develop a visual spatial map for, as I said, locations, and then the metadata file, a site that would be easily, or a file to register basically your observing system project that would then have data links. This is not a site for any of the data, but it would say where the sampling is done and where the data is placed. The second in the process, and they're not necessarily in priority, but most likely the second would follow, is that to develop tools to facilitate and update the data locations that will be changing as well as the portal. So these are things that are like the research active sites where you could actually share information, data sets, something that would be automated, so when a new system comes in, or new set data sets, that it would actually be automatically uplinked into this spatial information tool. The target audience would be to the Arctic Observing, for an example, Observing Viewer, to develop a recommendation, develop a pilot project that's more international, to connect with these groups, perhaps with the EU's Arctic Information Center that's in development, as well as other international networks that are doing similar type of spatial displays. And that would to request SAON to use their data task force, one of the task force, to also develop a similar type of example of data display for the observing systems for the 2004 summit. The second recommendation was to improve agreement for international open data access for observing system data. And this is our recommendation to stand up a group for the best practices document. That would include not only the science, but all the stakeholders, for explicit involvement of community-based observations and indigenous communities into the process, to prepare a draft guideline by Helsinki to go forward, that could then go forward under SAON. We had target audience requires stakeholder discussions, use SAON as the international facilitator, and that we would look at the, recommend that the committee look at the best practices document that was just brought forward at the Arctic Science Summit Week under IASC by all the working groups. And that is best practices, look at that, modify it, and use that as a starting point, but to come back with specifics related to that, as well as the any of the needs for the observing system that could be brought back for discussion. And so that would actually, they'd need to have some subgroup doing this, but it wouldn't be that hard to do because that actually best practices should be coming out in the next week or two. The third one is to develop a best practice guidelines for collaborating and observing amongst all the stakeholders, so science, industry, agencies, local communities. One task would be to evaluate some successful case studies of science and stakeholder engagement and the data sharing, and one in relation to, for example, industry was what we were thinking at that point. And then to reiterate and put together that, recommend that coalition of the World Ocean Center and other partners to develop the guidelines for cooperative activities with industry, particularly to address questions of legality, ethics, and data access. So the audience for that would be industry, academic science, resource managers, local communities, and the partners would be WOC, SAON, IASC, and the Arctic Council working groups and task force. That's it.
Thanks. Any comments? No? Okay, so what we'll do is we did run, we started a bit late, so we'll reconvene at 1:15. You know, the goal is to give you a bit more time for lunch, but also not to extend